when I advise governments on the continent about this energy transition and the just transition debate, one of the things that I say to them is, despite how the West has acted in terms of going back on their commitments to go greener and to reduce emissions, because they are facing their own energy crisis since the Ukraine war. The other thing we have to also understand is the geopolitics, of the whole energy transition debates. The truth is that, Africa without its own money, Africa without its own financing has to be dependent on the West for some of the development funds that they need to green their economies. If we had all the money in the world, I think, the African Union coming together with all of the heads of states to say, this is how we're designing our own energy transition plan would make sense. Specifically because we're a codependent economy on the continent. One of the things that I always say is the energy transition is going to happen anyway. The questions the heads of states and the governments in Africa need to ask is, at what point do we want to play in this energy transition? Do we want to get left behind? Africa is already behind on a lot of indices. So if the rest of the world then decides to transition in a few years when there's a lot more energy stability, would we still be behind? Is there a space for us to now get ahead of the curve, knowing that a lot of the European countries are still also getting involved in their own energy transition mechanisms? And the question for me is, yes, we absolutely should take advantage of the energy transition mechanisms that are coming up. Design it to suit your own country, but make sure that you're setting targets that it's going to put you above the curve. Because listen, the truth of the matter is, whether we like it or not, the world is going to go green. We've already seen that happening with a lot of the global oil and gas companies now opening up a transition office, an energy transition desk, or energy transition department, or even a renewable energy department in their oil and gas companies. So big oil and gas companies are now thinking of going green, are playing in the carbon market, are thinking about how to decarbonize. African states on their own cannot then say, we don't think this is fair, so in this way that we're not going to be players. What they need to do is to collectively define what the terms of the energy transition would mean for the continent, and then individual states then set their own targets that are realistic to make sure that their voices are on the table and that they're key stakeholders and key decision makers in how we transition. I think the last thing I was going to say on this particular question is, one of the things that we also have to understand outside of the geopolitics is also the fact that we stand at an advantage now because, like I said, with so much left to be done. For instance, when you talk about Kenya being at 98%, one of the things that happened at the Energy Indaba in Cape Town earlier this year in February was that the AU, in conjunction with some other partners, with NEPAD, and I can't remember, I think the Energy Commission of Africa and African Energy Commission, has brought up a document called the African Integrated Energy Network, where it allows nation states to sell power, that is generated from one country to the other at a reasonable price, at market prices, but reasonable considering the brother to brother, sister to sister, Ubuntu type network that the AU is trying to emphasize. And what that means is that if Kenya, for instance, is able to generate a lot more energy than it needs, it's able to sell to its neighbors in Uganda, in Rwanda, in Tanzania, for instance, and sell the excess to them while retaining the much that it needs. And that would also force those neighboring countries to then decide that they want to go greener, because then, it's giving them the mechanics of how their neighbor is doing this and going green and being able to achieve net zero, to also implement some of those borrowed policies from across the pond into their own energy and electrification plans. So absolutely, this works in terms of how countries sell power to each other, but it also works in terms of how countries exchange knowledge sharing and exchange technologies with each other.